Hello, everybody. All right, well, thanks again for joining us for the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. Thank you for being here in our competitive advantage presentation room hosted by the CAGR, the Craft Analytics Group. I couldn't be more excited to bring up our next speaker. He'll be presenting on reimagining why through needs-based segmentation. Again, couldn't be more excited to have Ticketmaster as a sponsor of this panel. It'll be great to see Chris Kennedy from the SVP of Data and Strategy from the Seattle Mariners come and present on this topic. So with that, Chris, if you don't mind coming up and getting us started. Thank you.
I guess I can walk over here because I have my own microphone. So already the ones that grab lunch and talk way better, they're probably going to have a better time than most of you that have to sit and wait for lunch, but that's okay. I can't promise that I'm going to be faster because I really like the topic we're about to talk about. I'm not going to promise being funny about this, but at a minimum, I'll be done in 20 minutes. So wherever we land with this, my ramblings, wherever they go, 20 minutes and we're done, but I appreciate your time here. This is really a consultant way to say, how do we incentivize both internally and externally what we're looking to do and achieve? And so when we think about the operation of the business, it's really important that we align rather than sitting in these silos that we're so used to in sports. The more important thing is talking about fans in a tighter way. I know Justin Woolen's sitting here. He's a healthy skeptic of this. That's fine. I accept that. But maybe I can convert him into a believer at the end of the day of how we start to look about with these. And I don't have. Yes. How do we go back? I'm not the SVP of technology. Is there a way? We got to go back. There we go. All right. So here's how we're going to present this magical journey today. First thing we'll start with is the Mariners and how we think about strategic planning. Very key, a nice to have, and we start talking about fan segmentation, but you don't actually have a plan of how you're going to incorporate it, is an exercise in futility. Then we'll start to talk about the why. We say fans, but I don't know until this year we really understood who our fans were. And then probably the more important for Justin, this is like how we can apply this the next time moving forward rather than just being able to know that your dog Spot likes yellow baseballs, right? So we started this, our new president that came on in early 2021, Katie Griggs, she had a true vision of recognizing strategy plays a really important role in what we try and do. Try and move out of the insulated industry that we're in of we've always done this and we've been successful. Because let's be clear, sport's really hard to mess up. Depending on what's going on in the macroeconomic factors of things, at the end of the day, people still really like sports, still really want to come, so it's still pretty easy to sell a ticket to them. But strategically, how do we start to maximize the value both for the fan, that experience, enhancing that, and also for the business so we can be able to build that virtuous flywheel as we do that. Katie took our mission, dedicated to winning championships, creating unforgettable fan experiences while serving our communities, and started to put it into a concept of pillars: fans, staff, revenue, and brand. And so we can really start to think about, as we work on our daily activities, are those the things that we're actually affecting change against? Then a pivotal part of time in the Mariners' history is I was lucky enough to come on board and really change the game. And what I mean by that is we went through something that people understood at the 101 level, and we tried to add objectives and key results to things so now we can start to understand a little bit more directionally we're going this way. Let's start to think about progress and measurement. How do we do that? Let's start to think about the activities that we can align on to push things forward and really get everyone on the same page. So how'd we do? Not great. 2 of 8. I guess if you're a baseball player batting .250, you probably need something else, like you got to be fast or have a glove, something like that. I think where we do look and think about things that were important to us is the 4 of 5 from the year prior. Different number, yep, I did the math too. The 2 is this was the first time we had measured these things, so not applicable to the year prior. And the 3rd one, we couldn't actually figure out how to measure something we wanted to make progress against. And so again, in the theoretical, if you can't actually measure, it's really hard to start to align where you want to end up. Qualitatively, the things we learned, 1 is clarity of objective. So rather than having 2 sentences explaining an objective, how do you break that down so it's on the tip of the tongue to every single employee that you have, so they understand clarity of purpose as they're working and driving well. Lining the incentives. Another is too many priorities isn't going to be effective. You need to be able to ruthlessly prioritize. We have a finite amount of resources, whether that's dollars, whether that's individuals or people. You have too many things. People start to look at this type of work as their night and weekend or the other stuff. I'm going to do my day job and then I have to go do these things. And so you're really not going to get the buy-in. Change management is going to be critical for a lot of these things. And then finally, make sure that you can measure the things that you think are important. That's number 1, making sure you can measure the things that are important, because if you cannot, it's really hard to hold yourself and the teams accountable and understand if what you're doing is successful. Let's go put a marketing campaign. Did it do well? I don't know. Some people clicked on some things. Did they buy stuff? I don't know. So really being able to hone in on what's effective with your resources. This year, we went with 1 objective to rule them all, quasi-movie reference, but not all the way. And the intent is really simplify it, sustainably grow our fan base. It's simple in language, people can understand it, but there's 2 key words in there, sustainable and growth, which means we need to get and project that message farther, broader. We need to make sure that it's actually resonating with our market. And then we have to be able to actualize what we promised in that messaging. We can probably convince someone to buy a ticket and come to a Mariners experience, but if the beer is warm and the hot dogs are cold and everything else is all a mess, they're probably not going to come. And so what ends up happening is you're not going to be able to sustain that type of progress. Took those other pillars, if you will, and put them underneath. 1 I love, so I stole from the baseball team. Doesn't matter, get better. How do we empower the individuals that are doing the work on this? How do we give them the understanding and clarity of purpose? How do we invest in them to become more capable professionals on a daily basis so they can continue to push this forward? Become the most loved sports franchise in the Pacific Northwest. You'll see later that's not the case today, but that's cool. But really sticking true to that brand and being consistent, and finally being good stewards of our fiscal assets while we're doing that. I'll take a spin on that when we talk about it from the business side, and we talk about the primary goal to increase and sustain club revenue. Sounds like almost a negative thing, but again, I go back to, if we can put a value proposition out there that resonates with a fan base, they come, they experience, and say, yes, where perceived value remains above price, they're going to come and they're going to pay, and we're going to continue to generate revenue so we can continue to enhance our experiences. And so when we talk about this specifically today, we have a 5-state region that we can potentially talk to for this, so we can begin to measure things. The key is that 50-mile radius is how we looked at it. Those that we can start to track, are we making progress both from a messaging standpoint, as well as are they purchasing into the idea that we're providing them? When we start to think about fans, the way we thought about it first was demographically. I remember sitting in a meeting in July, and my colleagues were saying, hey, let's go after 18 to 24-year-olds. Well, maybe we should diversify our market. Well, how about we go after families? And then you can just stop and raise your hand and say, do we know any of these exist? Like, do we know any of these truly exist in mass and numbers that's actually going to move the needle in our market? Dead silence. We've just kind of been doing it this way. We've got a kids club. It's awesome. So the kids are going to come, right? But it's really we don't truly understand what our market looks like. So you can go about it looking at it demographically. Really easy, low level of work, but it's really not going to tell you and scale on the things that are interesting to you. Next, you move to the how. How are they purchasing? Where are they engaging with our content? Better, more resources needed, but now you're going to get into that trap of thinking that a single ticket buyer is a single ticket buyer is a single ticket buyer, and that's just not the case. We don't really understand why one is purchasing versus the other. Finally, we moved to where we thought would be most impactful, more resources, but again, slowing down, taking our time, being methodical about how to truly be effective with aligning our initiatives, and going towards a more needs-based point of view, starting to think about why do they come to the park? Is it because they want to spend time with their family? Is it because they're diehard baseball fans? What are the actual motivations? not only when they're looking at the Mariners experience, but holistically. Once we have an understanding of the why, we can start to ruthlessly allocate resources to the appropriate places where we can win and avoid those that we can't. The inherent nature of our business is let's bring all the fans in. Let's focus on all the fans. Let's do that, and congratulations, you're not that great at any and all of them if you go that route. And so being able to focus on where our strengths are, continuing to enhance there, and recognizing there's places we're just not going to win. We recognize what that is, and perhaps that segment of our market isn't going to get it. The second time, it creates clarity of purpose. So if I'm talking to a marketing team, if I'm talking to ticket product strategy, et cetera, we can really start to understand where they can be effective, where we can continue to align internal to meet the needs and making sure we're hitting that message with our fans. Mariners fans, understanding who these individuals are. So we did a lot of analysis. We got some external survey experts to go ahead and come in and start working through this. And the intent was to build noticeable clusters and then dig in to understand the personality traits of these individuals, what were common. For the intent of this exercise, it wasn't how do we get far enough so we can focus differing messages. It was more an interesting exercise to start to understand commonalities. Mariners have a large market size, and so when we start looking at that first one, it's more of directly towards live entertainment. That second layer down is any type of affinity towards the Mariners, we would say is our addressable market. And then again, we bring in that 50-mile radius to make sure these are the ones that if that message resonates, the barriers are low enough where at a minimum, they'll give it a try. So meet our segments. There's 7 up here, 6 we really care about, and we'll bucket them into 3. The primary ones that we sit there are ballpark traditionalists, engaged trendsetters, that secondary nice to have, active explorers, connection seekers, and then the oh by the ways, and we'll get to why in just a second, are the bandwagon suburbanites and detached no-shows. It's really important, by the way, the math on that slide versus this one. We don't have a live feed. The percentages have not updated. It's more of a rounding error on my part, but plus or minus, they're in the same category in case you're going back and forth on those. So the first thing we took a look at it from an addressable market, the size of these type of segments. Quite pleased that the 2 that we spoke to, the engaged trendsetters and the ballpark traditionalists, had a heavy presence in our registered user base, and that's people that are coming to games, that's email contacts, et cetera. It was also nice to see that the next 2, the active explorers and the connection seekers, were resonating with them. And again, when I talk about the distribution and where we should focus time, effort, and energy, we've got a 2% on those last. And so what that means, unless they are of high value or of the highest value, the amount of resource and energy to convince them to come to a baseball game directly would be somewhat of an exercise in futility. We can maximize in those other areas. The other thing that was interesting here, too, is understand that we over-index in the ballpark traditionalists, recognizing feedback that we're receiving today might not be weighted appropriately to their size in the market. And so it's one of those things that we'll get a survey, we'll jump, hey, they're saying this, let's go do this. But if you're over-indexing on the wrong crowd, perhaps you need to make sure that you can appropriately handle that type of variability. Once we had a general idea of where we thought we wanted to focus, next, we went into the psychographic profiles. I won't go into all of these. I think the one that's really interesting to me is the neuroticism. And this is more specific when we talk about allocation of resources. Seattle came off of a pandemic. We have a homeless crisis that is improving, but it's not great. Where our ballpark resides is on the south part of town, and so the perception of safety, we were fearful that this was going to deeply impact what we were doing. And so let's focus. Let's put resource, cleaning up, working with the city, all good things. But when you start to look at the segments that were of interest to us, recognizing they're a little bit more stable and understand those things they can't control aren't going to be as high of a barrier to entry as we had anticipated. And so while we can continue that work, we recognize the ballpark traditionalists, they don't care. They're going to continue to come, and all of those other ones as well. And so again, it's just an example of how we can start to leverage just basic personality traits, what is and isn't going to impact them. The second thing we thought was really interesting is their sports fandom, how they thought about sports. NFL is not on here because it crushed every single one of these. So the Seahawks are still the thing because we don't like to win a lot in Seattle. We're working on that one. Remember, dedicated to winning championships. Here we go. But what's interesting about this is starting to look at the places of interest for us. Specifically, NBA resides in there. So it's almost as if they're doing the research on our behalf. If you think about the NBA fan from a demographic standpoint, skews younger, more diverse, more liberal leaning. How do we start to understand what resonates with that fan, and so we can either incorporate that or double down on the things that we're doing to continue to engage those messages. All right, so this is kind of the fun stuff. I apologize if I go on tangents. I'll work really hard not to, but really we start to talk about the dimensions. XY axis, it's qualitative in nature, so think of this more as in social settings versus not social settings, introvert versus extrovert, and starting to figure out what those dimensions are. The farther they are away from the origin or displaced from each other, distinguishing difference they are. Where this was important for us is when we start to think, where do we lay our cards down from a marketing budget strategy? Where do we start to think about those things? If you go after one and focus on one, if it's a message that resonates with another, that might be effective. And so now it's two birds, one stone type of concept. We talked about we're never going to get to the bandwagon suburbanites. However, if we're messaging those ballpark traditionalists, the way we do it, if we start to talk about relaxing and unwinding, if we start to talk about something fun to fill my spare time, they're not going to be turned off by that messaging, and so you can still continue to remain present even in the ones that you're not actively targeting. Another part that was really interesting is when we start to think about staying away from messaging that's unique to a single cluster. And so if we want to start talking to active explorers, let's not go up in the bounds where that message resonates with them and perhaps not. Rather, let's take a look at, is there a segment that we can start to use messagings that will catch some of the other ones? So again, it's framing, it's starting to set and understand what those incentives and those initiatives might be. Similar concept here, we talked about motivation stronger than barriers, especially when you start looking at the psychographic dimension of neuroticism. But as we're building differing messages, understanding we're going to cluster some together, let's see if we can't address both the motivation and by the ways as we go in those same segments as we go through these things. Attitude towards athletes. This one was incredibly exciting for me to think through and our team to go through, mainly because of what we learned from last season from our Voice of the Customer data. So when we looked at that, we went out and we set a goal. We want to have an overall fan experience of an 8.5. We were currently at an 8.2. The obvious anecdotal is we raise the overall experience score, the propensity to return is going to go up at the same time. Neat. What we found throughout the year, though, the true correlated variable is actually emotional connection to the team rather than overall experience. Highest propensity to return comes from emotional connection. Easiest way to connect a fan base is through your players, through your strength, what that looks like. And so when you look at this, these parse out in almost a character versus swagger type of a move. And so when we think about how do we try and connect from a messaging standpoint to get the most bang for your buck, it's not going to be a personalized story about how they finally made it to the major leagues. Exciting, enticing, the detached no-shows, that will really resonate with them. However, it was more on the swagger scale we saw, the athleticism, the youth, the excitement that we can do. And so as an exercise, even for this conference, I checked some of these attributes together on the swagger side to a marketing team and said, hey, can you throw me a sizzle video that hits in those? Because that's really how we want to start thinking about it. And so this is what they came up with.
Exciting team with a very young team. Come on out, support these guys because they feel the energy.
It's kind of cool hitting on those young messages, even convinced Scott Service, exciting, young, putting in those attributes to go in there. talked about marketing, how to go there. I think the other thing that is missed, and we won't go too far into that, is how you can start to use other facets of your business to amplify the message. And so we start to think about partnerships. If we can understand this and we can put together packages of more authentic interactions with our partner, we're going to be inherently more successful. Oh, by the way, they will be too. And so not only are they able to amplify the message that we want out there, but they're going to recognize the value from direct customer use. And so that puts a multiple on when we're talking about customers. How, hey, we know our fans. We know our fans use your product. By the way, we'll take a multiple on that one. Okay, cool. So we talked about the who. We have an understanding. We generally went through and understood the positioning, et cetera. Those things then start to move up of putting that media plan together, driving activity. We got a bar league right now to get after those young, engaged enthusiasts to where ultimately that resonates at the end of the day when you step into the ballpark, and from the merchandise you're purchasing, from the amenities that you have, they're all singularly aligned. And so those people that are bringing that from the inside of the Mariners are all after the same thing, and so the message isn't diluted, being more effective with that. So what's next? Define the opportunities. We're starting to go down that route today, understanding new versus sustainable sticky. Marketing message we've talked about. Mapping the registered user base. That's an interesting one. We can talk after about how we're thinking about that, because not everyone's going to take a survey. And by the way, surveys are inherently flawed, weird. And so really figuring out how can we map that a little bit better. But the big one for us is this doesn't exist or work if you're not intentional about the technology to put this in play. If we understand this, but we don't have some type of a customer data platform, or we're not using customer relationship management in the appropriate way to feed each other so my salesperson has the effective messaging, we're not going to be able to maximize the strategy. So that's really where we land. I went through the last part because I'm over time. What questions can I assist you with? Please.
Really insightful. You mentioned the total addressable market, right? Like the entire, Seattle market that you know has some sort of affinity for the Mariners, but you might not have data on all of those folks. Where do you find that broader database, or where do you find that broader customer base? How do you identify what their behaviors are and kind of relate it to your database?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the addressable market components, you can start to understand the personality traits. Our hope, again, this isn't a pat on our back, this is kind of where we stand, and we'll see where it goes from here, is if we can more effectively map our internal registered users based on whether we're using demographics to start to identify that buying behavior, we'll look to then put those out in the market as well through some of the channels. A big one for us is community engagement, bar league, QR code type sign up, and so people can start to go out that direction in hopes that if these messages and it's consistent throughout the percentages and they start to see those, then they'll start to come in the same direction as us, capture the data, and continue to enhance and evolve. I think the one thing that's really nice about these concepts, it has a long shelf life, right? And so I may move or have certain characteristics within a certain segment, but we don't have to redo this next year. Rather, we should double down on that. Fan council, start to understand and make sure that we're evolving those. But from a shelf life to where it's probably going to remain consistent in the addressable market, we're hopeful that that happens. Thanks. Please.
I've got a question. How are you using this data to decide on how you manage your stadium and how you manage the renovation of your building?
It's a great question. So we've already started that a couple of years ago because we had a general understanding of some of those, and they just happened to merge together. So voice and consumer, lines are too long, et cetera. So specifically around the stadium, we went to the grab and go type of a technology, finishing up that this year, where we're going to have one, in essence, in every entrance you come in, you're going to go by a grab and go. And so really being able to execute and finalize what that strategy is. The other, probably perhaps the more challenging one, is going to be what are the things that we can continue to evolve in the ballpark, and what's the return on investment in the primary, because we're still primary first, secondary second, right? And so if we're taking out seats and putting a great kids area because we identify families, that's where we need to land, that's going to be a really hard sell of like, that's not generating money today. And so I think that's how we have to start figuring out how to be effective with, though focusing on the third, fourth, sixth, 10th year out of something that we would strategically do to the ballpark, we have to talk about in today's terms, this is what you get, and oh, by the way, it only gets better from there.
Chris, thanks very much. That was an excellent presentation. One of the things that I really liked was the way in which you talked about really going back to simplicity and making things very clear and I won't say basic, but very, very structured. How far can you, as you evolve, is that going to get broader and broader, or are you going to double down on the things that are really working and keep it simple? Like, what's that sort of spectrum look like?
I'll go back to my consultant roots and say it depends. But I think where we're looking is even structurally, we talked about objectives in this annual cycle. The reality is those 4 pillars remain consistent as the strategic development of some of this clustering. And so start with the simplicity. If we talk about all 5, they're really going to struggle. And so we'll start with the 2. Understand, A, if we're being effective with aligning incentives and messaging. B, is it actually generating ticket sales? Or even though they're the most that engage with your brand or not, perhaps that's where we continue to expand. For us, I would say in the near and midterm, we'll probably double down on effectiveness, almost from the buy-in and cultural buy-in of the team to recognize that, oh, we're more effective when we generate things together versus I'm going to go make my marketing campaign, I'm going to go develop a new sales ticket product.
All right, and we are at time. Thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.